Hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to another webinar sponsored by Cambridge. Let's just wait a few seconds until more people get in. Yes, we have 25 people at the moment. Welcome. Yes. Oh, wow. Hello. From the seat of Egypt. Oh, that's great. That's great. That's a wonderful idea. If you could write in the chat box where you are joining from, that would be really nice. Thank you very much. São Roque, Brazil. That's great. São Paulo. Hello, Natalia from Campinas, Brazil. That's wonderful. That's great. Porto Alegre, Rio de Janeiro. That's wonderful. Okay. Welcome to this webinar. I'm Sergio Varela from the Marketing Department of Cambridge in São Paulo, Brazil. It's really nice. It's really nice to have you all here. Today we have the pleasure to have Colin Ward with us for another interesting webinar. The title of the webinar is "You're Not on Mute: How to Increase Student Engagement Online." So Colin has been teaching ESO for over 20 years and has been an ELT materials writer for more than 15 years, publishing print and online materials for several publishers, including Cambridge. He received his MA in TESOL from the University of London and is currently a professor of ESO at Lone Star College, North Harris in Houston, Texas, United States. Colin also co-curates a successful ELT blog called englishendeavors.org, englishendeavors.org, where he shares classroom and research-informed lessons, activities, and strategies with the ELT community. A very special guest with us today. So before I hand over to Colin, just a bit of housekeeping, okay? Please use the question and answer, the Q&A box for questions to Colin. I'll keep an eye on it, and at the end of the session, we'll answer those. You can get a certificate for this webinar if you wish. At the end of the webinar, we'll put a link in the chat box to a feedback form, which is really, really important for us. And once you fill in the feedback form, you'll be able to download the PDF for your certificate. You just save it on your computer, include your name on the PDF, and that's it. You have your certificate. Okay. So without further ado, I hand over to Colin Ward. Please enjoy.
Okay, thank you, Sergio. I hope everybody out there can hear me. Maybe say in the chat box whether you can, just to make me feel a little bit better. Okay, excellent, thank you. So thank you to Sergio, and also thank you to Cambridge for putting this together. I'm really excited to be speaking to Brazil right now. It's a place that I've always wanted to go to, and maybe one day I will be able to go there and maybe even teach there. I've had a couple Brazilian students in Houston. We typically don't have a lot of Brazilian students, but we sometimes have au pairs from Brazil. And I had an au pair in my class last semester, and she made this amazing food. And I looked up the name. It was called Brigadeiros, I think. It's like a chocolate, cocoa, buttery, yummy, sweet snack. And anyway, I really enjoyed it. So I'm here. Yes, that's it. You can probably say it better than me. So I'm here to present this webinar, You're Not on Mute, and it's about increasing student engagement online. And these ideas really grew out of COVID times. So at that time, I was department chair at a community college here in Houston, and I had about 8 full-time teachers, and I had about 10 part-time teachers. Hardly anybody had experience teaching English material or ESL or EFL online. And so basically none of us knew what we were doing. So it was a lot of trial and error. And unfortunately, because it was so fast and it was so unexpected and we were so unprepared, we did lose a good amount of our students and quite a large amount of our population. Part of it was because our students prefer to be face to face, but the other part was those ones that we were trying to reach online, we just were not reaching them the way that we wish we could have. So I'm going to kind of talk about what that taught me, and also kind of what I've learned by going digital, by creating materials for a digital or online environment with Cambridge, which I've done through Evolve Digital. And so when I was on this project, we realized that we are ready, that we have to do something different. We cannot just, we have to more than just repurpose. We have to think completely differently about how we're going to interact with our students and how we want our students to interact with each other. And these are the questions that we really had in mind. So how do we go about that repurposing? What kind of activities are appropriate for online and which ones are not appropriate for online? Which ones are more appropriate to do asynchronously and which ones are more appropriate to do live with your students? How do we keep the students engaged? How do we make them want to keep coming back? How do we sequence activities? What's the best way to sequence? How do we scaffold? And the real big one for me, because I was in that experience during COVID, was how do we help make teachers feel like they're more in control of what they're doing online? Do they know what tools they have available? And I'm sure if you have taught online or if you've tried to teach online, you've probably had these same exact questions going through your head. So I'm going to share how those questions really impacted the way that I've been developing materials and also using materials online with my students. So in the chat box, I want you to put some ideas here and tell me what are, if you've taught online or if you have a hybrid class, how have you measured participation online? What have you done to say, yes, this student has participated in your class? If you could put a couple of your ideas in the chat box. So it's more likely more than just unmuting a student, right? And waiting to hear them speak. There's lots of different ways that you can facilitate participation depending on the lesson, depending on the goals of the lesson. And there are lots and lots of ways that we can facilitate and assess participation. So we can have, of course, students reply to a prompt or something in the chat box. We can drop in on breakout rooms is another way to do it. We can assign specific roles for students to take when they're in breakout rooms. We can have students report on what another student has said to the class, and we can also have students record what they've produced from a lesson, and then they can either record it in a written form or they could record it in an oral form. So there's lots and lots and lots of ways. Yes, and so another one here is how much they're answering questions. Yeah, so, and I'm going to show you a rubric that I've used that kind of allows me to keep track of how my students are engaging and how much they're engaging. I don't always want to necessarily be punitive. I mean, I think one thing in an online class is you want to be just as encouraging as you are in a face-to-face class. But we do want to have some kind of rubric or way to assess what your students are doing and whether they're doing the work. Okay. Yeah, another one said take them to breakout rooms for discussions. Right, and that allows you to assess participation separately. So I'm going to get into these different ways of assessing participation. Let's see if I can go to my next slide. But in addition to measuring, this is really also about facilitating engagement, and you really can't measure if you're not facilitating it. If there's nothing to measure, you don't have anything to do with it. You have to get them to talk and get them to participate before you can even do that. So this is like my big picture about how to facilitate online engagement so that you're able to then measure their engagement. And these are kind of principles that I've been using as an online teacher, as well as ones that helped me as I was writing materials for online. And it really all comes down to two main things. It really comes down to motivation and to preparation. So first of all, when I'm online, I focus on practice, not presentation of grammar or presentation of skills. My main focus through that hour that I have with my students online is focused on practice. So this is like the flipped classroom, right? So we can allow our students to do kind of the more rote activities asynchronously. We can record videos to give instruction and have them watch those on their own, but then take advantage of those precious moments that we have with them online to focus on practice either with them or with them practicing with each other. The next thing that I've learned is I prefer to prioritize open-ended activities because they are more interesting and more motivating. I also include game-like activities because despite the fact that most of my students are adults, we all love to play games and we all like a little bit of competition. Another key principle has been to, when I'm providing or making materials or creating a class discussion, to make sure that I personalize and localize the information so that it's relevant to my students and so that they're motivated by the content. And then preparation is key. So I found if I don't prepare my students well for a discussion, I can have difficulties in an online environment. It's same is true if I haven't prepared them for face to face, right? It's gonna be an issue. But even more so for me, I want to make sure I prepare them for a discussion. So how am I ensuring that they're prepared to participate online? How can I set clear instructions and expectations for them? And the reality is, when I am teaching online, there's more scaffolding that's going to be required than if I'm with them live face to face. So these are the 5 principles that are going to take us through the rest of the presentation. And if you have any questions, please do feel free to put them in the box. So that was the last one. I forgot to hit the button. Sorry. Was to set these clear instructions and expectations. So these are the 6, not the 5. Okay, so I want you to look at these 2 activities. And these are very common activities. They're practicing the simple past. And in the chat box, I want you to put which activity you think would be better suited to online. Would you rather use something like A, or would you rather use something like B? I'm going to wait a minute to see what you have to say about that. Marcos says B. Julia says B. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Right. That's where I was hoping you were going, right? So B is much better suited because it allows for the practice of the grammar. The first one, A, would just lead to a very dry, boring activity live, right? That's the kind of stuff that we want them to do on their own in online practice or asynchronously. But B is a great activity that you can do online. It's exactly the kind of thing we want them to do. So we are testing their use of the simple past, but then we're getting them to talk right away using it, right? Right. And it's making room for a conversation. Exactly. And that's what we want. So when we were making decisions about what kind of activities we could repurpose or even reuse, B is one that I would reuse. I would probably have 2 students. I would unmute them. I would have them practice it. I would give them feedback live with the entire class. And then I would put them in breakout rooms for pairs and have them practice A and B and then switch roles. Okay, so now I'm going to get into those 6 principles. So the first is using open-ended activities. So we're going to do this together. This is an example of an activity that is reviewing the vocabulary that students have studied. The vocabulary there is in purple. So we're going to do number 1. I want you in the chat box to say something that you are frightened of. For me, that would be tornadoes. I don't know if, do you have tornadoes in, you probably do. I don't know how common tornadoes are in Brazil, but I grew up near, no, you don't. Okay. I grew up in the Midwest near Chicago, and as a kid, we had tornado drills in school. So we would have to like hide underneath our desks, and the sirens would be going off. And ever since then, I have nightmares. All my nightmares are usually about tornadoes. Okay, snakes. So I guess Brazil has a good amount of snakes, I would imagine. Spiders, heights. Yeah, interesting. Heights, needles. Yes, no, I'm not a big fan of those either. Great. And so, what I would do at this point then is I'm seeing everybody share in the chat box, and then I would go and I would mute someone. Like for example, I would say, "So Julia, tell me about your fear of the heights. What exactly?" When have you felt that? Where do you think that came from? Mice, crocodiles. Yeah, I definitely would not want to see a crocodile. So, I mean, we're getting personality out of our students. I mean, that's the kind of activity that I love, right? We get to see what their fears are, right? But in a safe space. So I would have them in the chat box, and then I would call on maybe two or three of them to give a little bit more detail, ask them more questions, like, why, Anna, are you so afraid of crocodiles? Where does that coming from? Where does that come from? So the reason this is important is because you give them time to think in the chat box before you decide to unmute them. That gives them time to think, to formulate. They also see other people's responses, which might spur them to think of something else as well. So I really like to do that. I like to go to the chat box first before then I would go to unmuting particular students, because then they have had that time to think and to prepare. Okay, really interesting. I wanted to do a food you can't resist, but I don't want to run out of time. I'm a big foodie, so. Okay, this is another open-ended activity. So the previous one was an open-ended activity that I would use for like whole class, right? This is an open-ended activity that I would use for a breakout room. So this comes from a lesson where students were talking about career goals, and the grammar in that unit was focusing on uh, modals of necessity like must and have to and don't have to, as well as verbs like need to. And I'm curious, so this is something that I would have students do in a breakout room in pairs. And if you had pairs in breakout rooms answering these questions, about how many minutes would you let this activity go, do you think? I want you to put your ideas in the chat box for me and tell me the amount of time that you think would be, a reasonable amount of time for two students to answer these. Maybe 5. Hmm. Yeah, so I would say about 4 to 5 minutes is what I would do. So sometimes, if this was a group, I would probably allow more time, but we don't want the activity to get too stale. We also don't want students to think they have to answer all of them. There are going to be some students who get through these very fast because they are pretty advanced. There's other students who are weaker and it would take a longer amount of time. I wouldn't need them to complete them all, but I think a quick thing like this would probably be about 4 to 5 minutes for me. It doesn't mean you can't go longer. Obviously, if you go longer, you have the opportunity to check in on all of the breakout rooms, perhaps. But if it's a short task, I do not drop into every single room. I drop in randomly. Right? If I allow more time, then of course I'm going to try and do a little bit of time each. The other thing that to mention is when I go visit these breakout rooms, I prefer to really be more of the observer. I don't interject. So it's better for me and it takes less time to have my pen and paper out and take notes on some of the common errors or common issues that come up. And then after I have brought them all together, then I will share those notes with them as opposed to interjecting because it's going to take too much time. Okay, this is an example. This is point number 2. So to include some game-like activities and a cute little dog there. And so we're going to do this activity. You're going to use the chat box here. And this is a guessing game. So guessing games are great because they are based on extrinsic motivation, this desire, to win. I'm sure that your students are probably a big fan of games. This is a game using emotional additives that are participles, right? So amused and frightened and fascinated. And so the students have done the work already at home on the grammar, and this is just practice and fun. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read you a couple of sentences, and I want you in the chat box to write the feeling or the adjective that I am displaying. Okay, so here's number 1. Would you please stop tapping your foot? So what is my emotion there? Would you please stop tapping your foot? Am I fascinated? Am I frightened? Am I surprised? Yeah, I'm annoyed, right? And how do you know? Well, you can tell by my tone of voice, right? So the reason I like this kind of activity, right? And so you're racing, right? So Julia wins that one. She was first, and then Juliana's second, Pan is third. So what's fun with this is with you play with your voice, you get into pragmatics. You can voice intonation, you can model intonation, so students know how to use their voice emotionally, right? If you don't model that first for them, they're more likely to say something like, "Would you please stop tapping your foot?" Right? Rather than hearing the annoyance, but you heard the annoyance, right? Okay, let's try another one. My dog is very afraid of the thunder. What's feeling there? My dog is very afraid of the thunder. I'm not annoyed anymore. Maybe amused? Surprised? Maybe, yeah. Okay, let me try it again. My dog is very afraid of the thunder. Shocked, frightened, yeah. I was going for frightened. Shocked, I think I would be like, my dog is very afraid of the thunder? No. Right? So, what I'm doing here is I'm playing with my voice, and we're getting into something that students cannot get without the interaction with you as the teacher. Okay? Okay, I'm going to do one more. I'm a bit sad that I couldn't make it to the party. Yeah, disappointed. That was more clear. Yeah, good. So you can play around with this. So when we created these materials, we had good job. Disappointed. So we provided sentences, but you can use any sentences you want, and you can use your voice, and they can hear your voice. And this whole thing is a race. You can keep score. So Julia got number 1 on that one, right? And then you can declare a winner. So I'm sure you're using game-like activities, and I'm sure your students like to use these. But I really like ones that require a little bit more. I mean, not just like not just an obvious fill in the blank kind of activity, but something where they also have to really listen closely to try and figure out what the answer is using those pragmatic skills. Okay, cool. Third, uh, personalizing and localizing. So as you know, the online environment can be very anonymous feeling, right? So we want to go for activities that are personalizing and that are localizing. I want my students to feel like they are the masters of the material. And one way is to do that is to allow them to draw on the material that is about them and about where they live. So this is an activity where students are working in groups, but we are personalizing. And you'll notice that one thing that we really think is extremely important is that we're providing useful language, which provides scaffolding for the assignment. So they're answering these questions. My example would be, so I'm really into cycling. I like to do this activity both alone and with friends. I usually do it 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 times a week. It's fun because I get to see the city and I get to learn about different paths through the city. So I would model this and then I would have students go into breakout rooms, right? So I want to make sure that they hear me say it and that they see that I'm using those questions and the language um, to scaffold the activity. This is an example of localizing. So this is where they would be talking about a problem that is in their city and describing it. So one thing as textbook authors is we can be kind of limited in material that would be useful for local students. You know, we have to think more about a global market. But then what is happening out there on the streets? What is happening out there in the student's own neighborhood? What are the issues of concern that are in the students' lives? So in addition to all the vocabulary and the grammar and the skills that they're getting from their course materials, I want them to be able to talk about things that are happening around them. And as teachers, I think we have this really amazing ability and this opportunity to focus on content that is tailored to our students' lives and goals and context. And this was something that we really wanted to focus on when we were developing these materials for Evolve, and it influence activities like this, where we're really wanting them to talk about their own place, where they live. And then this, after they've had that discussion, we can then have them transfer those ideas to a grammar activity where they're using quantifiers to describe what is in their city. And so when we tie content to grammar in a meaningful way like this, it means that the grammar is much more likely to stick. And this is a much more meaningful way to practice grammar than it would be, you know, than to do like a fill in the blank activity or a matching activity. You leave those for the asynchronous classes. You could have students write these in the chat box. You could call on students. You could make this a pair activity where they're using the stems with each other. But I really do like this idea of using stems because it makes them produce the grammar in a meaningful way rather than just kind of, you know, matching the grammar, which for me doesn't really go very far. Okay. So my fourth point is how do we help students prepare for group discussions? So and probably some of you have gotten your CELTA, and one of the things that they teach is, you know, you're supposed to wait, you know, at least your 7 seconds, right? After asking a question before a student speaks, because you want to give them time to formulate their ideas and formulate their answer. Of course, being online, that can take even longer because we also have to deal with technology and unmuting and muting and all of the logistics of it. So when it comes to group discussions, one thing that I try to think about is how can I minimize the amount of time that students are silent. And so one way is for me to lower the stakes. And I do this by giving my students the discussion question the day before we meet online so that they do have time to formulate their answer. They might write notes down. And I also tell them what order I will call on them so that they are prepared. So that's a lower stakes approach to helping students prepare for group discussions. If it's a higher stakes approach, like perhaps with a higher level class, I would maybe give them a list of 3 different discussion questions that I'd want them to prepare a day or 2 days before. And then I could still tell them what order they are going to talk, but I would choose the question that they will answer. So that's a little bit higher stakes. They have to be prepared for all 3, but they at least know what 3 that they need to be ready for. So looking at these 3 questions, for example, this is about a unit about risk taking. I would use the first question for my lower stakes question. When did you take a big risk that paid off? Because that would be something that's more narrative, which for me is usually something that is more doable for a lower level, and it's easier for them to speak about themselves. And then I would include number 2 and 3 for that higher stakes scenario, where I have higher level students and they don't know which of these questions they're going to answer, but they know that it's going to be one of them. Okay. So 5 is about setting clear instructions and expectations. So we know that online will always take more time than face to face. So one of kind of the rules we use that when we were creating materials for pairs, we would allow at least 2, maybe 3 minutes per person, but groups take longer. So if I have a group of 5, the same activity, I would be more on the higher end of about 3 minutes per person rather than 1 or 2. So it's really important to make sure that you're setting realistic tasks and sizes and times, and to remember that it's always going to take more time than you expect. Larger groups are, of course, more unmanageable. I've found that a group of 4 for me is like a really manageable size. I've also found that when I have even numbers of students, it tends to work better than odd numbers, which is interesting. You want to make sure that your instructions that you're giving students are really clear and concise. I also post instructions in the chat as well as verbally, so they can see it on the slide, they can see it in the chat box, and they can also hear me say it. So they're getting it in 3 different places, which means it's more likely that they're going to understand exactly what they're going to do. A lot of times, the silence can come just from the fact that they are not exactly sure what they're supposed to be doing. So if you can make that clear and concise, you're going to have a more successful environment. I also make sure that I break down group activities into smaller chunks and manageable chunks. And I'll show you an example of what I mean by this. So I don't want too much going on in one go. I like to make sure I have stages and that they're aware of those stages and how much time each stage is going to take place. I also want to make sure I provide language for the task. I'm a big fan of sentence stems to help them complete the task and to also help them give them language to keep the conversation going. And then if the task is more complex, I tend to provide a guiding worksheet, that they can download. And I'm going to show you what this will look like with an actual task in the next couple of slides so you can get an idea of what I mean. So in this task, students were working in groups and they were proposing some kind of improvement to their community. So we gave them some ideas. We allowed them to choose their own. So cleaning up a public space like a park, creating an after school program for teenagers, planning a social event for the elderly. So we're personalizing and we're localizing here. And here you can see those stems that I'm talking about, those useful phrases, right? This is reviewing the language that they had learned for turn taking and to show comprehension, right? So like, oh, that's a good idea, or on second thought, or good point, right? So we wanted them to use those, and by having them there on the slide, we're more likely to hear them use them. So this is a 3-part project. So very first thing is they had to decide on what the project was, and then they had to make an action plan together as a group on how to carry that out, and then they had to present it to the class. So because this is a 3-part assignment with 2 parts of preparation, I would have my students literally get out their phones and take a screenshot of this slide, and then I would show them the next stage of the activity and have them take a screenshot of this slide. And I would explain this second part. This is where they're going to be making the actual plan, answering the questions like what are the roles people will have? How can you do this project as cheaply? Notice that we have other useful phrases here, right? Where you're offering other ideas like if we do this, we can do this. At the same time, we're going to need this. So they're going to be taking a screenshot of this as well before I put them into their breakout rooms with their groups, right? Because I don't want them to have to come back here. I want them to be able to stay in their breakout rooms if they have it on their phones as a screenshot. Or you can take a literal screenshot with their computers as well. Um, then it's more likely that they're going to have less trouble. And then it's also really important for each of those stages that you identify how much time they should be using for each of those two parts of the task. And we made sure when we were writing teachers' notes for Evolve Digital that we were putting in these parameters. So you need at least 8 to 10 minutes for this, or 12 to 14 minutes for this. And you can also, of course, put those times in the chat boxes as well. This is an example of a guiding worksheet that I was talking about. So this is really the same information. It's just in a document form. So this is another way that you can provide the information to them, or a secondary way. If students could go online and download this maybe from Google Docs. If you use Google Docs, you could send this out through your learning management system if you use one. So again, it's the same information from the slides. It's just in print format. So again, with online, I want multiple ways that I can make sure students can access that information, because if one way is not working, there needs to be a backup so that we can have a seamless experience together. Okay, so this also brings up the issue of accountability. Just make sure my time's okay. Yeah. So as far as setting clear roles and instructions, it's easier in an online class, and I've been there myself, to just kind of sit back and observe and not participate actively. But then there's the other issue is there's students who can be more like natural leaders, but can kind of also take over. So I've used these 4 roles pretty regularly when I do groups of 4. And this is another reason I like groups of 4, because I have 4 very clear roles. So by assigning roles, students are more likely to assume the role and follow through with the role, and take on that sense of responsibility. So we have the timekeeper, a facilitator, the archivist, and the reporter, and the presenter. And I'm going to show you what these look like. And I would put these roles in my syllabus, right? So I put them in my syllabus so the students already know immediately when we are online that they are going to, at times, assume one of these 4 roles. And this is what it looks like. This is what I put in my syllabus. So we have the role, so the timekeeper, for example. For each role, I have clear responsibilities for each one, and I break it down to 2 measurable responsibilities, right? So for the timekeeper is to keep track of it, to remind the group of how much time is left, for the facilitator to keep us on task, make sure all the members contribute equally. But in addition to those 2 responsibilities, I also want to give them those stems. I want to give them that useful language, right? So for example, the facilitator might say, oh, well, we haven't heard from Sergio yet, right? What I love about stems like this is that the grammar here doesn't matter. They don't even need to know the grammar in these stems to be able to use it, because it's tied to the task and we're giving it to them as a chunk of language. There's a noun clause here. I think what we're saying is that, right? That's pretty complicated grammar, using a noun clause after I think. It doesn't really matter though, because if they're given a stem, they will use it. I don't know if any of you have read work by Ellie Hinkle, but she's one of the perhaps the first linguist who was suggesting that one of the best ways for students to learn and use a language is through phrases, right? And through collocations. And since that research started coming out, now it's pretty normal to see these in textbooks, right? That you don't learn a vocabulary word just by itself, right? It's too isolated. You put it into a phrase, and so the grammar is embedded, and your students will use it. You can have a separate conversation about what it means, but that's not the point. What we want here is fluency. What we want here is production. So by providing those phrases for these conversations online, we're greasing the wheel, and we're going to allow for those discussions to hopefully have a little bit more flow, rather than students having to figure out how to manage those conversations themselves. I hope that makes sense. And when I think about these responsibilities, I also think about my students. Yeah, Ellie Hinkle, Elihinkel, and she has her own website. If you go to elliehinkle.org, you'll see a list of all of her publications. And at the end of the presentation, I can give you the name of that specific one that kind of changed my whole thinking about vocabulary. Anyway, so the other thing is, when I think of these roles, I also think about level, right? So sometimes I'm able to, certainly if I'm face to face, it's much easier for me to assign roles, right? So if I know a student who maybe has really high listening skills but lower speaking skills, they would probably enjoy doing something like the archival work, right? Doesn't mean I wouldn't push them to do the other tasks, right? But we can vary it, and we can also think about level. You can also have them assign these to themselves in a group, and have them take on that accountability and responsibility as well. But the point here is, the more specific role they have, the more likely they're going to participate. Okay, so I'm going to give into just a couple of other final tips that have helped me as I produce these materials and use them. First, invest in a good headset. Really, really important in terms of being able to understand students clearly. I have a population of students coming from various Central American countries, as well as students from Vietnam. I've had Brazilian students. Sometimes I have students from Turkey, all very different accents. And it's really hard for me without a headset to hear them well, and it's also hard for them to hear me enunciate as well if they don't have a good headset. I put that in my syllabus as well. It doesn't have to be an expensive one, but it's one that has a nice microphone and good sound. The second tip is, it's good to specify your expectations about online behavior in your syllabus. So, for example, do you expect students to arrive on time or not? Do you measure that? Is it important to you whether they have their cameras on or off, right? So this is a rubric that you could show to students and say that this is going to make them accountable for whether they're present, whether they arrive on time, and whether their camera is on, right? I don't actually use this, but it is something that other teachers I know have used to increase that sense of accountability, but also so the expectation is clear. Next is to stick to a sequence that is pretty regular and anticipated. So you really need to know your lesson by heart. You need to know what's expected and what you're doing first and second and third. By sticking to a regular anticipated sequence and not changing it up every single time, like maybe you always start with, a short pair discussion, and you do a little bit of vocabulary, and then you go to grammar. It's a lot easier for students to know what they're getting into if you stick to something that's regular. The second point, though, is if you know your lesson by heart, you want that because then you can actually perform the lesson and do the lesson on autopilot, and allows you then to attend to other issues that are going to come up. For example, technical issues. Another mantra for me is to remember that less is more. So online is going to take longer. It's going to require more time. You don't have to do everything that is in materials that you're given, right? You can pick and choose, and you should, because you want to know what is going to work best for your students. But if you haven't tried, or if you haven't done, or if you're uncomfortable with doing fully online, I would definitely do fewer activities and allow for extra time, as opposed to trying to fit everything in. Next is to make sure that you're modeling all the time. Model, model, model. Make sure that students know exactly what they're going to be doing. You can model for the students, and you can also unmute students and make sure they're modeling the task for you as well. It gives them a chance to participate. It gives you a chance to give them feedback. But you always need to model before you have students go and do an activity. And then last, uh, is to use multiple ways for measuring online participation and engagement. Okay, so keep it interesting. Don't always use the same way of measurement. And that gets back to what I was talking about before. So I'm going to talk about these last 2 points of modeling and measuring participation and engagement a little bit more in a little bit more detail. So the easiest way to model is when you have sample dialogues, right? So here we have students telling their partners about plans for the weekend. I would unmute 3 students. I would have A, B, C, and I would have them do the dialogue for me. I would give them quick feedback on pronunciation and pragmatics, and then I would get them into their groups, right? So that it's so important on the slide, on the material that you're giving them, that you show them the model, that they hear the model before you get them to go into the room. Otherwise, they just kind of get there and they're not exactly sure what to do. As far as measuring participation, so this is a rubric that I adapted from Thomas, and it's an online participation rubric. So this is like live participation measurement. So my students are in with me in the room, or they're in their breakout rooms, and I'm assessing them. So I modified this rubric so that all my students are on the same sheet. It logistically just makes it a lot easier for me to do check poor or fair or excellent. You can always change the wordings here, but I have very clear kind of parameters for what would be kind of a fair assessment versus what would be an excellent assessment. So I don't know if you use something like that, but I find having this with me next to me during each session just makes it really easy for me at the end to do an assessment and to put it in my grade book. As far as measuring online participation, not live but recorded, I like to use Padlet a lot. I don't know if you've used Padlet. This is an example here of Padlet where my students were brainstorming the negatives and positives, the pros and cons of using smartphones. And so this was a way for them to kind of generate ideas, but also see each other's ideas about the topic before I had them present on their own opinion. Other examples would be Google Hangouts or Jamboard. A lot of teachers like Google Docs where you have shared documents. I like when I do use Google Docs, I found that I really do like to use tables in a doc to make it very clear what students need to be doing on that sheet. I also really don't require a lot of writing. I don't want them to feel overwhelmed by it, but I want to make sure that they're accountable and that they are doing the work. And if I'm focusing on content and ideas, I do not give feedback on grammar. I just focus on ideas. Polls and screenshots, of course, are other ways to measure participation. And a lot of times when I'm having them do this, when I'm having them do some kind of like final recording, whether written or oral, I I give them time in class to do it. So I'll say, okay, you have the last 10 minutes to get this assessment done or to get this assignment done. So I don't know if you've heard of Vokaru. It's a great website. It's free. And there's no account required. Students, which is great for my students. There's no login, there's no username, there's no password. And what they can do is they can simply just record themselves. And you see down there in the shot, they get a web address. They can send that to me in any way, shape, or form I want them to, whether in an email or perhaps in a Google Doc, and I can hear it instantly. It's such an easy way to get recorded feedback, right? if I use this, I make sure that my expectations are really clear. I tend to limit it to less than a minute of feedback. So perhaps it's a question I'm having them answer at the end of the lesson. I also would make sure I model that, of course. It could be something where they're reporting on what their partner had said in the final pair activity of the day. That makes them accountable, because then they have to report on what they and their partner were talking about in a short amount of time. You know they did the task, and you also get to hear their pronunciation and their vocabulary. It's also good for role plays. It can be used for longer things. So a lot of times we don't have time online for everybody to do their role play for the class. So assign them to do their role play in Vocaroo at the end of class. You would be able then to listen to all of them. And then on the next day of class, you can pick and choose the ones that you want to hear. You could even play the one they recorded, or you could have them reproduce it for you. It could also work that way for group presentations, right? So it's going to take a lot of time online for them to get their group presentation together, and then give them time to record, and then or give them time to present and go from one to another. You could do it in different ways, but you could have, just a few present. I don't usually have all of my groups present online. It's too much. But then I have all of these recorded versions as well. And we don't have to do it all in the same day as well. Anyway, just a plug for Vocaroo. Looks like some people are saying that they're using that. Yeah. And I just love the fact that you don't have to log in. You don't have to have an account. I think it's great. Okay, so I want to end with a quote from one of my favorite people in the field, Diane Larson Freeman. And she said that teacher agency is necessary in promoting learner agency. So one of the common issues with online is motivation, right? Students may lack intrinsic motivation to be there, so we need to make sure we're providing that extrinsic motivation, right? We can foster that through the design of our course and through the approach to our course, through games, through various forms of feedback, through eliciting meaningful collaboration with our students. And the reality really is that we as teachers have to take that lead to foster an environment where that can happen. And that's what teacher agency is about. We always talk about learner agency, but there's also that teacher agency. Yeah, and motivation is so important. Okay, the last point I wanted to make, I know I don't have much time, but is about this issue of vulnerability. And I was thinking about this morning when I took a bike ride before this. And I was thinking that last night I was with my students, and I walked into, and wanted to show them the test that they were going to take, and I wanted to explain one of the questions on the test and what they needed to do. Well, overnight, some wizard had come into my classroom and they replaced my projector, they replaced the projector screen, and they replaced the little control panel that I use to change my inputs. And I had it ready to go. We took a break. I was going to show them the test, and I started pressing all the buttons and getting a little too finger happy, and the screen went blank, and I could not show them anything. And I was like, oh no. So I had one of those moments, right, where the technology, I myself screwed up the technology, but it wasn't working. And, so I basically just laughed, and I said, guys, I really wanted to show you this, but unfortunately I was a little too trigger happy, and I made it so that the technology is not going to work. And we had a good laugh, and they were relaxed, and then they took the test and they did well on the test. But my point there, the thing that I was thinking about this morning is, like, it's good to show your vulnerability with students, especially when it comes to technical stuff and online stuff. Like, it's okay to laugh at myself, because they're feeling that they can feel the same amount of, frustration that we have. And I just think it's good to remind myself that I look human, and that I'm not perfect with technology. Anyway, so that was kind of the last comment that I wanted to make. All right, so I'm going to stop talking. I know we only have about 5 or 6 minutes, and I want to see if we have some questions, Sergio. Now I'm just kind of reading your comments.
Yes, we have a question from Juliana Vilarinho Faria. She says, regarding the use of stems, how to deal with students who expect to recheck all their sentences, which might not be possible.
So part of that is if I'm giving them stems to use in speaking or in writing, I explain to my students what that stem is doing, that the grammar is embedded in the stem, right? So, if you give them a stem like a piece of work, right? Using a and of become part of that chunk. That's what Ellie Hinkle talks about. They become part of that chunk, and the students learn it as part of that chunk, and they're using the grammar correctly. And so I would explain to my students that the better way to think about grammar is to think about it in chunks as opposed to word for word. And the benefit is because that's the way the brain works. The brain works through chunking information. The brain wants to be really, really efficient. So you want to teach vocabulary in phrases as opposed to teaching vocabulary in isolated ways, because the brain can handle that, and you're more likely to remember the phrase in that, or the vocabulary in that form of a phrase. um, I when I use phrase when I have students write vocabulary sentences all the time. So I'll take like the 10 or 12 vocabulary words that we're focusing on. It tends to be like academic vocabulary in my classes, and I put them into phrases, and I say, okay, write a sentence with each. And the beauty of using these phrases is the sentences tend to be almost 95% correct. They might have a little preposition wrong somewhere, but because I'm using the phrase, like if one of the words was essential, right? I would give them a phrase with like, it is essential that, and they use it correctly. So there is no need to correct. So I guess part of that was getting them to understand that by learning vocabulary in phrases, are automatically are going to have the grammar correct in there. At the same time, I don't mind having a student, ask me about specific grammar. All my students are different. Some students do really poor with learning grammar rules. They just, or they know that they use it correctly, but they don't. Then I teach them the rule, and then they get more confused. And so sometimes I'm just like, you don't need to understand. If you're using it correctly, then I'm okay with that. But in the case of a student like that, um, I wouldn't deny them the instruction, but I would just explain the benefits of using a phrase, that it's all embedded.
That's great. We have another question. We
Okay.
don't have the name of the person. The person asks, how can we adapt most of the ideas for one-on-one classes?
Okay, where you have an individual student with you, just one-on-one. I would say I don't have that, but I would make sure that you are giving them the same opportunity to prepare for those conversations that you're going to have with them. I would do a lot of stuff on pragmatics, because I mean it's just you and the student. You can switch roles. You can with the conversations, you can give them the conversation beforehand, and have them practice, and then go back and forth and give them that kind of. I mean, that's an ideal situation if you want to give feedback on pragmatics and pronunciation. So I would do a lot of that. The game thing would work, right? The one that I showed where you're reading a sentence and you're using your voice to get them to guess what the participial adjective is, would work. I would have them do I would use Vocaroo. I would probably have them go and in their own time go and record something, perhaps give them something to read aloud to test pronunciation, for example, to assess it. And then you can play it and you can stop it and be like, well, right here, you want to say it this way. And then you can keep going back and forth with Vocaroo. I mean, that's the beauty of it. They can hear it again and then they can correct it. But I would also use Vocaroo maybe perhaps to have them prepare something for, like if they're going to give, a very short presentation about, um, about a topic that they want to talk about, and they send it to you beforehand, and that way you can use your one-on-one time to give them feedback. So like for me, it doesn't always have to be live feedback. I really like that idea of delayed feedback with online as well, because there's so much to do online that is live, that is so hard to keep track of everything, that having those more recorded ways to assess it and then bring it in, it also alleviates some of the pressure on you as well.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Let's see if we have any other questions. No, we don't.
Great.
Okay, I would like to thank you very much, Colin Ward, for this incredible presentation. Thanks a lot, very useful tips. I would like to thank everybody that was able to stay with us this afternoon on a Friday before a long holiday weekend.
Oh,
Thank you
yes,
very
that's
much.
right. You have a holiday.
And I'm typing my email address to everyone. So in case you want to know more about Cambridge material for teaching online young adults and adults, please get in touch with me, okay? Thank you very much, and see you guys in the next webinar.
Okay, thank you so much for coming, guys. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.